Hello everyone. I'm Krishna Lewis and I direct the Fellows Program here at the Hutchins Center. And welcome to our new Alum Fellows Reading Series. We are thrilled that Alumni Fellow Candacy Taylor is here to discuss her new book, Overground Railroad, the Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. has said, quote, Candacy Taylor's own quest for Green Book sites throughout the U.S. reveals her own relentlessness, as well as a potent gift for bringing these sites and the Black past alive, unquote. An award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian, Candacy's other projects include Counterculture, American Roots, and By the Horns, which captures the lives of female bullfighters in America. We are also excited that Deborah Willis is joining us, also an Alumna Fellow. She is an artist, author, and curator, as well as university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She will have to leave the session a little early, though, due to another commitment. But thank you both, Candacy and Deborah, for joining us. And now I will turn it over to you, Candacy.
Oh, thank you, Krishna. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate being a part of this. And thank you, Deb, for joining me. I'm going to just give a basic background introduction. I'm going to read from Overground Railroad, which is my book that was published in January of this year. And it's about the Green Book and the roots of Black travel, but also about how America is shifted since the publication of the Green Book ended in 1967. I'm going to read today just a short excerpt from the introduction and parts of chapter 11. So here we go. It actually starts out with my stepfather, Ron. He's in the back seat of the car with his parents, and he's at the age of 7 years old, and they were in Tennessee, and they were driving up north for a short vacation. So the opening starts out with him in the back seat of the car. And his father turned to him and said, "Don't you dare say a word." Ron was sitting in the back seat as his father pulled the car to a stop at the side of the road. His father had told him, "Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to share my screen and show you some images." First, I apologize. Here we go. Okay. Here's Overground Railroad. Slideshow, play from start. Here we go. And here's Ron. "Don't you dare say a word," Ron's father said. He was sitting in the back seat as his father pulled the car to a stop at the side of the road. His father had told him to be quiet before, but this was the first time Ron felt the words reverberate to the pit of his stomach. Moments later, the sheriff stood over the well-appointed 1953 Chevy sedan, complete with all the modern features you read about in the magazines. "Where'd you get this vehicle? What are you doing here? And who are these people with you?" the sheriff asked. Ron's father answered, "It's my employer's car." He pointed to his wife, sitting upright and expressionless in the passenger seat. He pretended that he didn't know her and said, "This is my employer's maid, and that is her son in the back. I'm taking them home." The sheriff took a long, hard look at Ron's mother and then angled his eyes to the back seat. A young Ronald sat tight-lipped, too afraid to turn his head or even take a breath. "Where's your hat?" the sheriff barked at Ron's dad. "Hanging up right behind me in the back seat, officer." The sheriff waved, "All right, move on." As they drove north across the Tennessee border, a sad, eerie silence hung in the air. The jovial conversation they were having right before the sheriff pulled them over stopped, dead. And although there was no discussion about what had just happened, the gravity of the situation was clear. Ron watched Daddy and Mama exchange knowing glances, and then he turned his head to look at the black, unassuming cap that had been hanging next to him in the back seat ever since he could remember. It wasn't until that moment that he realized why he had never seen his father wearing it. Mama wasn't a maid, and Daddy wasn't a driver. He had a good job with the railroad, and this was their family car. Until that day, Ron never paid attention to that cap, but now he realized that it wasn't just any hat, it was a chauffeur's hat, a ruse, a prop, a lifesaver. During the Jim Crow era, the chauffeur's hat was the perfect cover for every middle-class black man pulled over and harassed by the police. If Ron's father had told the sheriff the truth, that he was driving his own car and that they were a family on vacation, the sheriff wouldn't have believed him. He would have assumed the car was stolen. In the event that the sheriff did believe it was Ron's father's car, the rage and jealousy he may have felt at the thought of a black man owning a nicer car than a police officer could have afforded would have triggered a beating, torture, or worse. From that day on, Ron noticed these hats strategically placed like unarmed weapons in the backseat of nearly every black man's car. Standing in the kitchen between the sage-speckled countertop and the wall-mounted oven, I listened to Ron's stories, stone-faced. Everybody had one, he said, referring to the chauffeur's cab. And you always kept it in the car. And then, without any provocation, other stories about his days growing up in Tennessee tumbled out. Ron talked about his cousin slipping out of town in the middle of the night because the Ku Klux Klan was set to lynch him. I listened with a knot in my stomach, trying to swallow my rage and sadness before tears filled my eyes. I didn't want my emotions to distract him from telling the story. Ron Burford was my stepfather. I'd known this man for more than 30 years, but this was the first time he had told me anything about the pain of growing up in the Jim Crow South. And it's not that he was a quiet man. Ron loved to talk. He could talk for hours. Me and my mom and my sister would try to scoot out of the kitchen before he started in on another one of his long Southern yarns, ones we had all heard before. But it wasn't until I started this project that he shared these stories with me. It was only then, at the age of 46, that I realized I had earned his trust. This was a huge accomplishment because after what he and most black men of his generation had lived through in this country, he felt he couldn't trust anyone. This is the second part of the later into the introduction. I learned so much about America just by getting off the interstate and driving through neighborhoods. Photographing Green Book sites gave me a greater understanding of and insight into the guide. On the road, I felt the tenor of a bygone era and saw a new cycle of grit and survival along Martin Luther King Jr. boulevards and in the dilapidated houses on dirt roads across the nation. I drove nearly 40,000 miles on America's two-lane highways, across acres of wide open plains and deserts, over mountains and along coastlines, but I also passed miles of blight and boarded up buildings in Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. After seeing communities decimated by poverty, crime, and destructive government policies, I was bewildered, brokenhearted, and then furious that human beings were living in such inhumane conditions. As I drove through the neighborhoods where Green Book sites once thrived, I could see the indelible scar that mass incarceration had left on these communities. I saw America for what it is, and not for what it imagines itself to be. I believe that a century from now, we will look back on this time in disbelief and wonder how we could stomach locking up nearly 1/3 of our young Black men. I believe this era of mass incarceration will prove to be at least as horrific, barbaric, and shameful as segregation was during the Jim Crow era. After years of research, I've cataloged nearly 10,000 Green Book sites and scouted nearly half of them. I found that approximately 3% of these businesses are still operating, and one of them is a Hampton House. When world-renowned musicians such as Aretha Franklin, Sarah Vaughan, Count Basie, and Sammy Davis Jr. performed on Miami Beach, they couldn't stay in the Miami Beach hotels, so they traveled inland to the Brownsville neighborhood to stay at the Hampton House, where they'd often play a second late-night set. It was during the second set, reserved for their peers, that the musicians let loose, relaxed, and performed the B-sides they didn't play for the predominantly white audiences. News of these jam sessions got out, and suddenly white folks were following these musicians to the Hampton House, making it one of the most integrated hotspots in Miami. The 50-room mid-century modern hotel boasted a grand lobby, wrought iron railings, terrazzo floors, and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The building was set on 5 acres and hosted both amateur and pro Black golfers who made use of its access to nearby golf courses. Tourists dined in the on-site Napoleon Lounge at tables with white linen tablecloths. Maitre d' Charles Martin, known for his gold lame tuxedo jacket, strictly enforced a dress code of jackets for men and dress shoes for women. Muhammad Ali stayed on the second floor right above Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s room. Ali first met Malcolm X at the Hampton House, and legend has it that it was this meeting that inspired the boxer to convert to Islam. Civil rights organizations such as the Congress for Racial Equality met weekly in the hotel to implement desegregation policies, and Dr. King rehearsed his I Have a Dream speech there. Civil rights activist A.D. Moore said it blew the place wide open. I'm telling you, he was fantastic. Once Black people were allowed to frequent Miami beach clubs, restaurants, and hotels, the Hampton House fell into decline. By the 1970s, a room where Dr. King had stayed became home to squatters, and a tree grew out of the pool he was once photographed in. The Hampton House, this is what it is today. It was on the verge of being demolished when thankfully Miami-Dade County invested millions of dollars in its restoration. Dr. Enid Pinckney spearheaded this effort, and since then the Hampton House has undergone a full transformation. It reopened in May of 2015. It's ironic that it was integration that killed most of the sites in the Green Book. It's also ironic that something as hateful as segregation facilitated a stronger sense of unity in the Black community. Years of enforced isolation, seclusion, and fear of connecting with people outside of one's race all came at a high price. All Black Americans wanted was the ability to walk, run, drive, shop, and live freely outside their neighborhoods, just like white people. After the Hampton House became another casualty to integration, community activist Georgia Ayers summed it up. She said, "We got what we wanted, but we lost what we had." While photographing the Hampton House in Miami and patiently waiting for a prostitute, naked from the waist down, to walk out of my frame, I realized I wasn't interested in presenting the Green Book as a historic time capsule. I wanted to show it in the context of this country's ongoing struggle with race and social mobility, because the problems Black Americans are facing today are arguably just as debilitating and deadly as the problems the Green Book helped Black people avoid more than 80 years ago. Given that most Green Book businesses were owned by Black families, to find one that is still in business was reason enough to celebrate. The sites that are still with us symbolize survival. They endured the times a pendulum of progress swung forward and a wrecking ball swung back. These businesses survived urban renewal and gentrification, and the people in these communities survived underfunded schools and overfunded prisons. When you go to these sites, remember that America is a messy collection of customs, traditions, values, and belief systems that have been shaped by capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Hate is hard to understand, and our relationship to it is deeply layered because history is fleeting, ephemeral, and slippery, and it changes according to who is telling it. The past is usually presented as a buttoned up, simplified, and often sanitized story that sidesteps the turbulence and whitewashes the journey, making it look like one smooth ride, one where we learned from our mistakes, righted our wrongs, and kept getting better. But this isn't how it happens. For every major push forward for Black equality, there was a swift and urgent white lash. So are we there yet? Hardly. When I mentioned the Green Book, the response changed from, "Thank God those days are over," that was when Obama was in office, to, "We need a modern day version of the Green Book." This was after Trump was elected. It's understandable why people think we need something to address the brazen display of white nationalist rhetoric, but given that Black people are legally able to walk in any public establishment, though in many cases, Black people are still feared in these establishments, a new Green Book will not make things better. The Green Book provided listings of Black-owned businesses and accommodations, and yes, a guide that showcased today's Black-owned shops would be a great asset. Still, a modern-day Green Book would not guarantee Black travelers safe access to those places or prevent them from being discriminated against at the airport or harassed by law enforcement or choked to death on the street. More than a new Green Book, we need to learn from our past mistakes. This country was built on racism, and if we're not careful, racism is a weapon that will destroy it. There are times when the fight for justice feels futile, but these are the battles worth fighting for, even if we lose. And if in another 20 or 30 or 50 years we find ourselves scratching our heads wondering why America still isn't living up to its promise of freedom and equality for all, at some point we have to accept that we are all responsible. As the author and educator Jelani Cobb tells the students at Columbia University, history doesn't repeat itself, humans do. So in conclusion, this is not a book about the history of road tripping and Black travel. It's more of a pilgrimage toward understanding a country so blinded by symbolism that it can't or won't tackle the pervasive, relentless forces that created the environment for the Green Book to thrive in the first place. It is a book, I hope, that will show us how we got here and why, after all this time, we still have so far to go. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see Deb here and we can start the discussion. Deb, are you there? Here we go.
Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you and also to learn more about the process. But
Okay.
also to
Deb,
see
1 second, really quickly. I'm going to share the screen and play the videos real quick. I'm sorry, but go ahead and keep
you're
talking.
going to do the PowerPoint, correct?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
So
But go ahead and keep talking.
you're going to do it now, right?
Yes.
So what I'm just thinking about the experience that I had in reading your book and following you over the years is that it's an extraordinary contribution to this history of ownership and retail shops and freedom of curiosity. The idea of representation through owning a business and to telling multiple stories is well documented. So it's a vital book, and I just want to congratulate you on offering this new story, old story, but also a story that needs to be reminded, all of us to be reminded about. We always talk about the disintegration of our communities based on integration and what happens. It's a complicated story. One of the points that I found really poignant in your book, in your writing, is the courage that I found in the storytelling of each person that you introduce. And so when I think about, Ron as that story is developed through it, you still want to share the screen?
Yeah, I didn't, it said it failed to share, so I'm going to try it again.
So
We're going to try one more time.
with Ron and his curiosity.
Uh-huh.
Just looking at my own life and thinking about traveling with my family, traveling to different places and to have that exploration was really significant. But also the curiosity that many of our fathers and mothers had as they bought their new cars and they traveled with their families to not only to see family members, but to sightsee, to explore America and the desire to live freely. And that's one of the moments that I found just fascinating with your story and with the work. I also wanted to ask this question, just so wonderful to discover. I remember as a child, my father only used ESSO gasoline. I never knew why, but that's the only gas station that we stopped. And we drove to Canada, we drove to South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, but that's the only place we stopped. And so I found that pretty fascinating. And to know that history, which I was unaware of. I knew of Spellman's story in Rockefeller. And so do you want to talk about how you discovered that?
Sure. Yeah, that is fascinating, because you read things, especially when you're doing research and you read in the archives that this happened, or you just by conversation, people say, oh yeah, all Black people used ESSO gas stations. It's like, well, really, was that true? And then you find out so many people actually really did. And I did some research at the ESSO archives at ExxonMobil, that's ExxonMobil today, and learned the story about Laura Spellman. She was married to Rockefeller, who ran ESSO, and he was on the right side of history, and they were on the right side of history. As a company, they hired so many different Black, from every stage of the business, whether it was Black chemists, Black men franchised their own stations. This was at a time when Shell stations and others didn't even allow Black people, didn't sell Black people gas, let alone let them work there. or even have their own business. So it was really critical and important. But we think that Laura Spellman, who was married to Rockefeller, influenced his decisions because she was a white woman raised in a house in Cleveland, Ohio, that was on the Underground Railroad. And her parents were huge abolitionists, and they were very fierce, and Spellman College is named after their family. So we believe that that's probably, she was basically making sure that he was doing the right thing. And in practice, it really did. It saved people's lives and it made a difference. And most of the people I interviewed of this time.
Back to that image for a second.
Which one? The one before?
On the right. Because I want to go back to Spellman. No, the one, it's this image we were just on.
This one? Okay.
Yeah. But hold on to Spellman. You can continue the story, but I wanted to ask a question about this image.
Oh yeah, so I was finishing up, but that's pretty much, we think, the story behind ESSO and Spellman. I don't know if I can actually pause it. I'll just keep going back, but go ahead and ask about this.
So one, the many exciting things that I found fascinating about the work is your research, but also as a photographer, I was interested in the photographs on the covers of the Green Book, but also the illustrators. So I was curious, did they highlight, do you know who the illustrator is for this? Is that Jackie?
Yeah, that was challenging to find. This illustration actually became the logo that Victor Greene used. Mm-hmm. Victor Greene was the creator of the Green Book, that he used on all of his stationery, this couple, like on the go. And I do write in chapter 10 about the irony of so many of these images. This one, at least they're shaded. They look like they could be of color, maybe lighter skinned. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the clip art in the Green Book and a lot of the images are either they look like they could be white or pass for white, mm-hmm. which was, interesting because we know Victor Greene was living in Harlem. He probably had access to a lot of Black graphic artists, but we also think the reality of the Green Book in terms of, the cost, and he didn't make a lot of money producing this, so they probably used what was available. But I don't know the original source of the artist who created this. Melvin Tapley comes in later in the Green Book, and he worked at the New Amsterdam News in New York. So he was an artist that was connected to the Green Book, and we think maybe he did some of these earlier illustrations, but we don't know for sure.
But I love it because it reminds me of the style of Jessie Orms, a woman in Chicago. So just in terms of, the hat, the liveliness of both of them are really stylized mm-hmm. in a sense. And so I really feel their energy of excitement with this Green Book.
Yeah, it is amazing.
But Jackie Orms. But also following the question, also when we think about integration and segregation, and these are just personal comments that I had and the experience is that here, don't let the sun set, that's one of the horrific stories. But my grandmother never liked CocaCola, and she only would buy Pepsi, and the whole family was Pepsi and I'm the Coca-Cola. So I was curious didn't know about that history. And so when did
Coca-Cola had some,
can you talk about it
that Coca-Cola would have on some of their, segregation was very real, and Jim Crow South, it was really Black, especially you have to know that the Green Book was most popular in the 40s and 50s during the second wave of the Great Migration was happening, and about 1.5 million Black people were fleeing racial terror in the South and headed north, and they learned very quickly that Jim Crow had no borders. So even Coca-Cola machines that, there's an image of one in some of my research where it literally says, for white customers only. Mm-hmm. Even in a vending machine, it was segregated, so at every level, not to mention, could you get gas? Could you use a bathroom? Could you eat? Even vending machines were off limits. It's incredible to the extreme to which segregation played a role at this time. And against all those odds and all those obstacles, Black folks still did it anyway.
Right? That's what the aspect of your kind of flipping the narrative on the railroad, the Overground Railroad, Underground Railroad. How did you decide on the title for this project?
You know, that's interesting because I was at Harvard doing a fellowship at the Hutchins Center, and I was standing in the Harvard yard with my fellows, and we were just chatting. And I said, you know, it was like an overground railroad. And John Jennings was there. He's like, he pointed to me, he said, that's the title of your book. I was like, you're right. And I called my agent right there, and I said, I think we should name it. She was like, that's perfect. It literally happened in the Harvard yard that we made that decision. So it's great that you asked that question. And I mean, because we're speaking at Harvard now, but yeah, that was John Jennings, who was, you know, because it was a term that I'd used before, but I never thought about it as far as a book title until he said that.
It's a perfect title. And you know, when thinking about Ellis Marsalis and Billboard ESSO, the respect that he had for the Green Book was evident in your writing. But also as a musician, I always wondered if did he also consider the fact that they traveled a lot, as you mentioned in your introduction, and that musicians could not stay in places and clubs and eat in certain places. I was curious about, do you know, did you interview him, or was there any way of knowing why he created this wonderful space? He had a 10-room hotel, and
yeah, the Marsalis family really did have some deep connections into the Green Book history. I wasn't able to interview the family directly, but I did have access to Becky Wilbur Sears and Calvin Ramsey, who had interviewed one of his family members. And they both, you know, the Marsalis Mansion, which was this incredible place on the outskirts of New Orleans that had swimming pool and great hotel and service the best of the best in terms of the Black, you know, social elite, and also the musicians. And of course, music is so important in New Orleans, and Black people couldn't go to the French Quarter at that time. So they went to other places like the Dewdrop and the Marsalis Mansion. So that was key. And also there was, you know, the Billboard ESSO station that was run by Billboard Jackson, who was a marketer for the Green Book, but also in conjunction with the Marsalis family. And so I think that was their introduction, if I had to guess, to the Green Book, because ESSO stations did distribute the Green Book, and there were generally, at every ESSO station, you could find copies of the Green Book. So, and their connection with the marketer, James A. Jackson, who ran this Billboard station, we think was probably the connection.
Another question I had is wonderful archive of photographs. Were they in institutions or in families, or how did you find? This is a great one.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's the Threet family in Luther, Oklahoma. They had a filling station right on Route 66 since 1915, and it's still there. It's not operating, but they're trying to reopen it. But Route 66 was a place where half the counties along Route 66 were sundown towns. So that's really critical that they were there. And in terms of the archives, it was challenging. And as you know, it was, you know, it's a 7-year process of digging and digging wherever I could. I did have a fellowship at the Schomburg, which really helped immensely in terms of just understanding what material was out there. But once I sat down to really put the book together, finding the archives that we could actually use, you know, the images that we could use and the prints and the permissions is a whole different ball of wax. I didn't really quite understand how difficult that could be. So, so what we ended up with the book is even makes it more special that we did get some family members that donated. But a lot of the Schomburg, the Library of Congress obviously is a huge repository. And, you know, unfortunately Getty was a source that I had to go to often, and they were very expensive. But yeah, it was many different, it was like an octopus. There were all these different places I had to go to gather the imagery.
The other important aspect for your work is to talk about leisure life within African American communities. That there was a desire for, you know, play
Yeah.
and joy, and that's really significant when you think about the family photographs, because there's work there, but also considering the piece about Route 66. Like, I grew up, there was a TV show called Route 66 I used to look at, but I never knew the sundown towns related to Route 66. I always thought just down Mississippi, somewhere down south. So just to think about that narrative that could switch if we knew this broader history of what could happen with our sense of place in these. And think of place, I'm looking at the MCA in Harlem, and that discovery of a place to stay there. Atlantic Beach in South Carolina. Um, this is also, there is American Beach in Florida, you know, and also places that people traveled for joy. And I love the fact that this is a hand tinted postcard. So where did you locate that postcard?
That was through, again, it was the Tickner Brothers collection they have a great postcard collection. But yeah, I think the audacity for us to play, right, in the midst of all the potentially horrible things that could and did happen to us, it, to me, gives this essence of not including joy, but also this resiliency and fearlessness of not letting people stop us from doing, you know, what humans like to do, which is play and have fun and take these, you know, these tours. This is Victor Greene's own kind of reservation bureau for people leaving, if you wanted to leave the United States even. I mean, the Green Book was, a lot of times, you know, we don't talk about it, it was an international guide. There were over 30 countries in Africa that were listed in the Green Book, you know. But then, yeah, like this image from Idlewild, I mean, which was an incredible, you know, in Michigan, playground for the Black, and not just elite, I mean, middle class too. You didn't have to be rich to have these really beautiful, just, you know, kind of getaways that were for, you know, where you could be comfortable. It was a huge, and I think it's something that we take for granted today, but again, carving out that space at that time with those kinds of conditions and the reality of travel and the dangers involved with it makes it all the more important for us to celebrate the people who did it, who took those risks.
And to follow up with that, in terms of travel for education, that the Black colleges that were listed in the Green Book, and that's something that, you know, you wouldn't even think about including in it as a sense of travel. But people who, I remember when my parents drove my sister to Howard, it was the time of the riots in '64, and you know how the roads that he had to take going down. So talk about that as your experience with Black HBCUs. And
well, the Green Book, that's what was interesting about, you know, Victor Greene, who created the Green Book. I think it was 1946 and 47 editions. You see him, he reprints an article from the New York Times that discusses the challenge of folks coming back from the war. And that although there were these GI bills, there was all this access to opportunity for white folks, for white veterans, but they knew that Black people would be left out. And so there's an article that's reprinted that's saying, you know, we need $1.3 million to help the HBCUs because there'll be plenty of Black soldiers coming back that you know, deserve the same treatment that white folks are getting. And so in that way, the Green Book becomes more than just a travel guide, right? It really becomes this kind of weapon for change, because education is a fierce weapon. And you see, and it's just wonderful to look, you can go to the Schomburg site, and if you Google NYPL, Greene book, and just, they don't have the 1946 edition, but they do have the 1947 edition. And towards the beginning of that, the magazine, you'll see that edition, you'll see the article there with a list of all these HBCUs, including Howard and Spellman and a bunch of others that I hadn't heard of, and a lot that are still around.
That's great. Also, just thinking on the road and food, people had to carry their own food, as you said of your stepfather. I love the fact how he talked about and guided you in making sure you had food to eat and you could eat at the airport. But you know, we kind of overlook the idea of privilege. But
Yeah.
look at the I don't know if that's at Sarah Lou Cafe in St. Louis. You know, chicken steaks and frogs.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so you know what the offering. You know, the barbecue, but frogs. You know, as a kind of an idea of what we could eat and things like that. So I think the joy of that in terms of people can connect in terms of regionalism, what happens with food and foodways in different communities. Were you able to find some of the menus of some of the places?
Yeah, I did. And, you know, the Los Angeles Public Library has a great repository of menus, restaurant menus. And so, yeah, there were some from Clifton's in Los Angeles. It was hard to get them reprinted in the book. Those were things where, you know, they fall in that gray area for permissions. So I do show them in some of my talks, but I couldn't get permission to print them in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But because a lot of those companies are defunct now, so you can't really get permission, and it's out of the years where it's public domain. So unfortunately, but the things that we ate, and they're very poignant of the time. And like you said, you know, my stepfather Ron, when I would come home for Christmas or anytime I'd be in Ohio, I'd try to leave to go on a plane or something, and he would try and load me up with food, and I would say, you know, I can just buy something at the airport. And he would just, and I never understood until I started working on this project, like why he would do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really the kind of the trauma and scars of his past. It's like, you didn't leave the house without food because you didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't guaranteed any once you left the house.
Yeah.
So he knew intellectually times had changed, but it wasn't until I worked on this book that I realized all those years, that's what he was doing. And that's what that was about. And I realized how privileged of a statement it was for me to say, I can just pick something up, you know, that's something that we don't think about today.
So my final question for you, because I'm going to dash to another, I'm glad we had this opportunity, is looking at the artwork that was in some of the places where people stayed, but also looking at your photography. So if you could talk about what it meant for you to photograph in Montana, in Alabama, and the range of places that you photographed. What camera did you use? And then also, what kind of discoveries did you find in making art from these photographs? I love the dewdrop in.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been a photographer. I've been an artist all my life, and you know, I used a Canon Mark III 5D, and that to me became also a really important part of this story, because we were looking at other publishers that we knew maybe wouldn't handle photographs in the same way as our publisher Abrams did. And it ended up giving more of a platform to the photography, which was really special. But I spent so many months on the road, years really, but months at a time I would be on the road, really looking at how these buildings look today and trying to capture something that made it, there's almost an ethereal quality to the images. I really needed it to not look like it was just shooting a building today. And, you know, it's really not easy to make buildings look interesting. But because of the richness of this history and all the different layers of history, I really settled on this kind of more muted, soft, not blurred, but a soft kind of clarity in the background. And, you know, images like this, it was just, I don't, having written the book, I mean, the writing can stand on its own, but it really needs the photographs to me to really bring it together and to bring the immediacy of, you know, not just how people are living today, but also the beauty and grandeur of these buildings and what they represent, because they symbolize so many things. They symbolize survival and, you know, all of the resilience we have as a culture, as a race. So I really am grateful that, you know, I did get to show the photographs. I'm curating an exhibition with the Smithsonian, and I'm the content specialist, and that's going to be launching at the National Civil Rights Museum next month in Memphis. So, and my photographs are also a part of that exhibition. That'll be traveling the US for 3 years. So that's a good, you know, also another opportunity to kind of give the visual narrative of this history. But yeah, it was an honor to be able to do both. My background, my master's degree is in visual criticism. So it's always, I've always lived in those kind of hybrid spaces.
I love this image.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's the, thank you.
This vantage point, you know, just kind of the spark of hope, light, the way the sun, you know, kind of comes through, and just looking at the angle of this. Is that the Rossonian?
It's a Rossonian, it's in Denver. And thankfully I lived in Denver for a short time. I probably went to this place 5 times and did, I don't know how many images, you know, shots, but it took a while to get that shot. And it was really, yeah, I was really lucky with that sun coming through, like you said, that starburst. And
perfect timing with that.
Yeah.
And do you know if any of the buildings were built by Black architects?
You know, I do know of one in Nashville. It was called it's a liquor store called R&R Liquor Store. And we have an image of his father who had a Black architect who worked on it. So, and we know the famous Black architect that worked on, in Murray's Dude Ranch. He used to go to Murray's Dude Ranch. He didn't build Murray's Dude Ranch, but his name is escaping me. Paul. He was out of LA. He did
Paul Williams.
Paul Williams. Thank you. Yeah. So he shows up in different Green Book sites. I can't find one in particular that he actually built. He actually frequented some of them, but yeah, it's that's the next stage of this project, is really finishing out the field research and researching the people who actually ran these sites. I do have a grant with the Library of Congress where I interviewed Green Book business owners, and that's being archived at the library. And in some of those interviews, I did get some access to the stories about the architects, but that's another project.
Well, I really enjoyed this time we had and look forward to following up. I know, Krishna, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but thank you all.
Thank you for your time, Deb, and I appreciate this. Was lovely.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Gates has a couple of questions. First, he conveys his warmest congratulations on this great work. And he has 3 questions which you can kind of answer together. One is, what is your next project? And he is also struck by your phrase, casualties of integration, and would like to know, what have we gained and what have we lost under integration? And finally, what has the reception been to your resurrection of the Green Book and the world it represented and reflected?
Okay, well, thank you, Skip. It's great to be here, and I know you can see me and I can't see you, but thanks for being here. And so I'm going to answer the casualties of integration first, that question. But I think, you know, my stepfather Ron always said integration was the worst thing that happened to us, and he said that a lot through a lot of years of my life. And it wasn't until I really looked at this project and got into this project that I understood why he said that. And when you look at places like the Hampton House, that's a really critical story. And it's true that although most Americans wanted, the theory of integration is really great, but the reality of it is when somebody has to lose, something, whether it's through gentrification or, you know, urban renewal is supposed to connect us in different ways. I mean, all of those social forces that were largely instituted by the government were devastating to us as a culture, whether it's, you know, the fact that the dewdrop, we could only go to certain neighborhoods in New Orleans. We couldn't go to the French Quarter. So as soon as it opened up and integration happened, Black folks went to the French Quarter because they had never been allowed to go there. So it makes sense why Black people generally abandoned a lot of these places in the late 60s and 70s. But by doing that, we really lost this nexus of this vibrant culture and the arts and so many things that really made us special. So getting back to that, I think is going to be a challenge, but I think it's really critical that we support our businesses, the Black businesses that we have left, and we incorporate and get capital behind new Black enterprises and businesses so that we can build up that vibrancy again, because we had it and we just lost it. And I think we lost it because we just didn't realize how special it was, or that we didn't think it would go away. So that's a sad reality. In terms of the project and the response, you know, from the book has been incredible. It really has. It's beyond any expectation I had. I mean, I know as writers, you know, we understand that even if it doesn't matter how good your book is, it doesn't guarantee you a wide audience. So I was thankful that, I mean, it made Oprah Winfrey's, you know, top 26 travel books. It's, you know, top 13 list in National Geographic for women who take readers on a epic adventure, I think was what it was called. It's been a bestseller status. It's really just, and I think because it's not just about the Greene book, it really is interrogating really what has happened since then. And it's really giving some kind of context to understanding why we're in the position that we're in. I thought things would slow down after the pandemic started in terms of, I went on a big book tour at the beginning of the year and then the pandemic happened and I thought, oh, it's gonna slow down. But then it ramped up again because of, you know, the healthcare industry and how the disparities in that for Black folks and the neighborhoods and with all the protests. There's still a reason why people want me to talk a lot about the book. So it's really still crazy and in a good way. So I'm really thankful for that. And in terms of my next project, you know, it's so crazy because I have the exhibition that's touring. I'm working on a mobile app. We just finished the prototype for. So that's going to be big. And I did the digital interactive map. I got a grant from National Geographic that I'm building on that project. So there's so many different parts of other manifestations of this work that'll probably be going on for another few years at least before I switch to a different topic. And who knows, I may never. I mean, I have 10 years of work left to do on this project. I could do if I maintain the stamina to do it. But and did I answer them all, Krishna?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Another question is from Giovanna Jones, and she says that her question is about writing, craft, and style. So were there any places that you wrote about or wanted to write about that no longer exist physically?
Oh, the Green Book sites, I mean, that's the reality, is about 80% of the buildings I've estimated are gone. And like I said, I've cataloged over 10,000, just under 10,000. So it's challenging because the reality of, you know, it's life, you know, a lot of these, regardless of whether they were in the Green Book or white owned or Black, I mean, it's pretty incredible if any business lasts 5 years. So I've estimated that about 3% are still operating. So for those, we do know, and sometimes the buildings are different and they're not, you know, so there's the architecture. I do have a grant with the National Park Service to really examine, to try and get these buildings that are still intact on the National Register to preserve that history. But yeah, that's been biggest, and that's an ongoing research project for me, is to investigate like who were the owners and what was the real history behind these businesses, because I think we can learn a lot about Black entrepreneurship, and also the role that other people, like there was a Zuni Indian trader that ran one of the Greene book, ran a site, and it was not listed in the Green Book, actually. It was called the Deanza, but it was a big prominent place where Black people were allowed to frequent on Route 66 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And there were so many different kinds of interesting people that ran these businesses. A lot of Jewish people, the Jewish family ran the Hampton House. So, you know, that's been a fun kind of deeper level, deeper layer to investigate for the project.
Mhm. She also asks, if you couldn't find or make photographs, how did you tap into your imagination to create a sense of place in the book?
I'm sorry, repeat that? If I couldn't.
If you couldn't find or make photographs, how did you tap into your imagination to create a sense of place in the book?
Well, that's where my writing skills have to hopefully kick in. I mean, you know, writing is the hardest thing I do. It's my least favorite thing I do. I'm not a natural writer. I struggle. I think a lot of writers, it's not easy for a lot of writers, but particularly for me, I've been an artist all my life, and that is really my default. When I take images, it doesn't require as much, it doesn't come from such a painful place as writing. So recapturing things, I mean, that's the hard part of, you know, also piecing this history together and making sure you're not conflating things or, you know, misinterpreting things or making assumptions about things. So it was always really important to stick to the roots of the archives, of understanding like this is, you know, there's a lot of people who say things like the chauffeur tap, for instance, was something I'd been hearing for years, and I'd read about it, but I never really thought I would write about it until I talked to my stepfather, and he just tells me this story. And I, you know, because I said, oh, is this chauffeur's hat a real thing, you know? And he said, yeah, it actually happened to me when I was 7. And then he tells me this story. So it was really kind of the interrogation process of really being critical about why you're including something, and to make sure that you're not making too many assumptions about the past, because it's very easy to do and it's done all the time. So that was a big challenge in writing this book. And again, having the photographs is always really a nice sense of proof, but the writing really does have to carry through and give you that whole sense of the story. So hopefully the book, you know, does that.
I think we have time for one more question, and it is this. It was a dramatic moment when you revealed that Ron is your stepdad. You said he'd never spoken in these terms, given to talk as he was. How do you understand the dialectic between memory and forgetting, the spoken and the unspoken? This is Bill Schwartz, I think.
I think, you know, the story, Ron was not supposed to be a part of the book. That's, you know, and the other thing that it's in my introduction, but I didn't read it today. Ron died the week I started writing the book. And he had been sick for a few months, but it was sudden, and I was devastated. And I literally had signed this contract. I had to get this book out, and I had 8 months to write the book, which was insane. Even though I'd been working on it since 2013, once I signed the contract, I had 8 months. I'd been on the road. My things had been in storage for years. I finally land, and I'm starting to write the book, and then Ron dies. And I am just devastated. And I wake up every morning before the sun comes up, writing on this deck and in tears. And I'm like, all I can do is write Ron's stories, because when I was on the road, he would tell me all these things. And these were stories he had never shared with me, because I don't think he ever trusted me with them until he knew I was really invested in this material. And it really brought us so much closer, because we were never really close. I loved him. He was my stepfather, but I was always closer to my mom, and he was just kind of around, you know, telling stories that we'd all heard before. And so I was, you know, we became very close during this time. And I called my agent and I was just in tears. I'm like, oh, I can write or run stories. I know I'm supposed to be writing the book. And she said, well, just keep doing that, because I didn't want to forget them. And then I realized after a couple of weeks, I'd written all these stories out, and I saw that they were touchstones for almost every chapter in the book. And so Ron becomes this narrative arc in the book that never would have happened had he not died. So in that way, it was, meant to be. I do love that this is in some ways an homage to him. He was my guardian angel, I think, through this whole process. And I miss him still every day, but this was a beautiful entryway into understanding who he was. And so part of the journey, my journey in the book too, is understanding these quirks and this behavior that I used to think was really irritating. Now I find it really endearing and almost painful, because it was trauma, I think, that triggered a lot of these things, these quirks in his behavior, like only driving at night and other things that you'll read in the book. But it used to drive me crazy because I thought they made no sense. And now all of a sudden, Ron, very dark skinned, large black man, Marine, very, alpha male, teddy bear, but totally feared because of his size and his, being that dark and black in America is not a good thing all the time. So it really just showed me a whole different way of what it must be like to have been Ron. And I hope, again, that the book does that as well. But that was a huge gift that I had no idea was coming, this process of writing the book.
Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for sharing this meaningful, much needed, excellent book. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Krishna. I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure and honor.
No, mine as well. Take care.
Talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.